Staying true, monetary policy moves made by the president. President Bola Tinubu promised a thorough house cleaning of monetary policy, adding that the central bank should work towards a unified exchange rate. And in line with his promise, the new management of the Central Bank of Nigeria, under his acting governor, adopted a clean float foreign exchange market policy. Now let's take a look and try to understand some of these policy moves by the president. I introduced him earlier. I'm being joined by partner, tax reporting and strategy. He's with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Is Mr. Kenneth Rikume. Thank you so much. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Tolu, for having me on your program. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yes, so suspension of the CBN governor, Mr. Godwin Emefiele, is a big one. And a lot of comments have trailed this development. Now, my question really will be, what is your assessment of the activities of the Apex Bank before this directive? Do you think it's been in order?
All right, so I think, if I can gauge your question properly, I think you were asking, if the monetary policies under the suspended CBN governor was, those policies were effective.
Yeah.
And what this transition means. I think that we have been quite in the forefront of mentioning the need of eliminating the arbitrage in having multiple rates for FX. And why we have put out that position is very clear. Because when you have those sort of uncertainties in the market, you create an environment that's not suitable to attract the needed investments into the country. So those policies, whether it be RT 200 and the Naira for dollar initiatives, those did not quite reflect the real demand for FX in the country. So, if you're adding 65 Naira on top of the CBN rate at the time, you wouldn't get yourself anywhere close to what the parallel market was saying. And for many companies, whether they be manufacturing, whether they want to pay for technology, whether they want to pay for import of raw materials or the purchasing equipment, they were never able to access a significant portion of their FX needs under the old, mechanism. So when we engage a lot of clients and companies in the space, most of them don't get more than 5% allocation of their FX needs. So they effectively have to survive one way or the other and, import their raw materials and effectively pay the parallel market rate. So these, the rates at the time were not reflective of the real market. So it never made sense for an investor to bring in $1 at 460, and then when they're taking it out, they're paying 750 something. So we had a lot of foreign direct investments that were stifled because of those, those policies. So what we have seen in terms of the change from the new government, particularly the acting, deputy governor, the acting governor of the central bank with the suspension of the governor, is a policy that makes sense, to allow the market determine the cost of the FX. So essentially, a willing buyer and a willing seller meet in an open market, and they're able to negotiate, what the exchange would be. Of course, that makes sense because what's going to happen is that you're now going to give more confidence, and we've seen a lot of the impact in terms of the signaling in the market. You're going to give a lot of confidence to investors to bring in their funds. One particular case for me, which I handled last year, was a very big European investor that was looking to set up a manufacturing plant in Nigeria. And the big deal breaker in all those conversations was actually FX. And this could have attracted, hundreds of millions of dollars into the Nigerian markets. Just think about all the other potential investors, that were, sent away because we didn't have, a proper policy. So the speed at which, some of these policies are happening are quite intriguing. But I must say, there have been, some controversies around, what happens when the CBN governor is suspended. I think clearly for many organizations, you have a clear roadmap and protocol for what's going to happen with those events. So there are succession plans, there are clear protocols. For example, in my organization, if I'm indisposed today, there's obviously people that can step in and begin to take action. And that's what we've seen with the acting CBN governor. And we've been seeing them putting out policies, putting out circulars, providing clarification to the market. And those are the sort of outcomes when I say we, I mean myself and my colleagues believe will take this country in the right direction.
Interesting stuff, as usual there, Kenneth. Let me follow up with the demand and supply thing that you've raised now, Kenneth. Let me ask you, many still believe that availability of FX is one major contending issue. Are we expanding these sources? Or what more do you think would help, shaping the forces of demand and supply, which we expect to help address this disparity in the market?
Yeah, thanks for that, important question, Tolu. I think the obvious answer to that is that monetary policy requires a comprehensive strategy for it to work. But what we have seen with the new administration is we've seen a lot of speed and movement to tackle some of the critical issues. And even before the elections, if you had asked me what would be my top 3 issues to tackle from a Nigerian perspective, or let's say 4, would probably put subsidy removal there, because you need to ensure that leakage or that wastage, from a subsidy perspective, albeit there are questions around what's the impact on the common man, but obviously that has to go, because 7 trillion naira contribution to foreign refineries, by the way, because you're not throwing that money at local refineries or local value addition. You're throwing it out of the country. That leakage goes out immediately, right? The next thing you obviously have to deal with is the FX issue, to ensure that there is availability and liquidity in the FX space, which I think one of the aspects we've seen here is the proposals to harmonize the rates and to make it lean on the forces of demand and supply. Of course, that's another very important aspect. The other one, which would be important, is actually security. And you can see some of the body language and the signaling out there with the current administration dealing with those 2 issues very swiftly. And then number 3, just yesterday, there were movements in terms of moving out and coming in of new service chiefs.
Yeah.
Because security would also be an important aspect.
Yep.
And security not just from an internal perspective, but even looking at some of our significant sources of FX, like crude oil, right? And of course, enhanced corporate governance in the public sector would also be key. And the signaling again yesterday is that there is movement in that space as well. So in terms of the signaling, and the body language out there, I think, it looks very, very positive. But just to pick on your question, which is, now we've allowed the forces of demand and supply to essentially take its course. What can the government do to ensure that there is liquidity for foreign exchange in the market? I think clearly the biggest issue of concern is one which I already touched on, which is the production of hydrocarbons. And I'm talking about crude oil and gas, right? Because when we get our production to an optimal level, which we did not have, we had a dilemma in the past couple of years where the price of crude oil was increasing, but yet we could not meet up with our production quotas. And that created a significant hole in terms of being able to meet the FX requirements, and of course, led to depletion of our reserves. But once we can get production up to an optimal level, then we can, and interestingly, the price of crude is now in a sweet spot. It's not above the $100 per barrel. It's now sitting in, around the 75% per barrel mark. Once we can get production up to a particular, a good level, then we would have, a good source of foreign exchange. But another thing that, the harmonization of the rates creates is that, for local users of the revenue that accrues to government, they get the right amount, right? Because before, if NNPC exports and NNPC has, surplus to allocate to the federation, it would normally come at 460, which was the official rate, rather than the real value, which was going to be 700 or 750, right? So there will be more revenue accruing, just from the dynamics of these two. But we still need to continue to look at things we can export. And I expect that the current government, when I look at some of their some of the manifestos that were put out even before the elections, the conversation around agriculture and some of the commodities we can export, we need to have a comprehensive strategy on how we optimize some of those commodities. I think we can seek to begin to compete and play in the space where the likes of Ghana, the likes of Ivory Coast are playing in terms of cocoa. We can optimize our exportation of sesame. So we can look at those commodities, which for us play to our strengths. We can also look at, one of the most important things which, apart from FDIs, apart from crude, remittances, the World Bank has some information out there of the importance of remittances to developing economies. For us, we have people with the JAPA movement who are now sitting in Europe, sitting in Canada, sitting in the US, and all positions in the world. We must have a comprehensive strategy on how we ensure that the remittances come in. I think now that the rates are reflective of the true market, people will be more encouraged to make more remittances back home to support their families. And it's interesting because remittances are so important because unlike FDIs are quite permanent because the investment is for a long term. But remittances, they stay in the country. So when someone remits $1, it sits in Nigeria because it's used by relatives for specific purpose, which would add value within the country. So remittances would also be key. And then the final bit, which is our human resources. So when you look at some of the success stories of several developing countries across the world, where you cannot play so much in terms of industrialization, there is something that you can easily, quite quickly leverage off, which is your human resources. What we have in Nigeria is we've got highly educated population because education is quite cheap. But of course we speak English, which is very exportable. So we have that opportunity of exporting and building a clear strategy around outsourcing, business process outsourcing, supporting with paralegal services, call center support, and different things which we can outsource, to ensure that we maintain that FX FX flow back into the country. So I think there's a lot that we can do. There are a lot of strengths. It's just that the enabling environment wasn't there. So we can pick up on some of these components and ensure the right environment is there for Nigerian companies and businesses to play in some of these spaces.
Yeah, well notable there, Kenneth, ramping up production, agricultural produce, all of that. And that's the way to go for more FX. We need liquidity in that market. Before I let you go, we've said so much about the monetary policy side. I think the fiscal side also needs to fit in. What do you think can be done, and what kind of cabinet do you expect from President Tinubu?
All right. I think we need to recognize the importance the fiscal space. There's a lot of things we can do, right? So it's difficult to speak about it, within a few minutes on a program. But obviously, we need to look at the social contract because, essentially the way fiscal policy works is you raise taxes and use that for government expenditure. But government cannot continue to focus on the strategy, which we saw in the last administration, where there was a lot of focus around introduction of new taxes and increasing taxes. Within the space of two years, education tax was increased from 2%, first to 2.5%, then to 3%. We've also seen minimum tax rate, cut down during COVID, then increased back again by 100%. And we see excise on telecoms. We hear about excise on tobacco products. We hear of all sorts of increases. But what the government needs to start thinking about is promoting that trust that the tax revenue is being used for the right purpose. And it's adding value to the life of citizens. I think that would be one of the key areas. Apart from that, I think the small, medium enterprises, micro, small, and medium enterprises, so-called players in the informal sector, we need to see how we can formalize them so that they can begin to contribute as part of society. And one of the ways we can do that is, number one, to ensure that we deal with the issue of multiplicity of taxes and ensuring that these guys have clear rules around how much they pay. There's clarity on who they're paying to, and it is used for specific purposes which impact on their lives. And the second thing is around, digital identification and having, all of these businesses clearly within the tax net. There are clear strategies of what has been deployed in other developing countries with good success. And if you take some of the examples from India and so on, around how you can start with a presumptive tax, where you assess these people, they have a clear amount they pay, and then you formalize them and try to support them with incentives, both, incentivizing them from a tax perspective, helping them with credit, which is very important for that sector, and then, incubating them and nurturing them until they begin to contribute more to society. So from my perspective, I think that those are the areas, that we can look at to ensure that, while we grapple with what everyone agrees is the right decision around the removal of fuel subsidy, we are also able to support these small businesses to ensure that they continue to thrive and they provide sustainable growth. Because these are the areas where a lot of these young men and women will be employed, and we can then deal with the issue of unemployment as well as part of a comprehensive solution.
I must thank you so much, Mr. Kenneth Rico, my partner tax reporting and strategy, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. I know it's a busy day, a lot of work for you on your table, so let me let you get back to work. I will see you and talk again some other time.